BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. BlackBoxNid88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. And welcome to BBOR, the home of true crime talk radio and your premier destination for unsolved mysteries, criminal psychology, and exploring the dark side of cyberspace. My name is Ned DeHaan, and I am your host, as well as the creator of AstroPsych 400 here on YouTube, and regular contributor to the Zodiac Killer channel. And a great way to support these shows is just by listening to some more content. But you can also go over to Amazon.com and have a look at the book Killer on a White Horse, written by me, Ned DeHaan. It is a novel, murder mystery, inspired by the Zodiac Manson connection, but it is indeed fictional. However, who doesn't love a good mystery? And there is always the TeeSpring page. Feel free to check out some of the merchandise. And remember, being weird is not a crime. Let the show begin. Okay, hello everybody. Today is Monday, another Zodiac Monday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? I hope everyone had a good weekend, and I would like to drop a couple of announcements and reminders before we truly begin. The first is that, to people who are listening to this regularly, or as this episode comes out live, the new Jack the Ripper series will kick off on Wednesday. That's the day after tomorrow, or if you're listening to this in the future, I will have made a regular series about Jack the Ripper that comes out every Wednesday here on BlackBoxOnlineRadio. On the Anything Goes Friday segments, I had been talking about the Ripper case a lot, and I decided to make it a regular show on Wednesdays. The first episode will be discussing the Jack the Ripper suspect Charles Lechmere, a part 2 to a episode that I've already started, and it's going to be under the name Jack the Ripper suspect Charles Cross, which was an alias that he used. So there are going to be a lot of true crime discussions to look out for on Black Box Online Radio, including the weekend segment, which now talks about the death of JonBenet Ramsey from 1996. And in the most recent episode, I was discussing the suspect Edward Edwards, who is not only a suspect in the murder of JonBenet Ramsey, but also in the Zodiac Killer mystery. Rather hard to imagine that that's true, but indeed it is. And if anybody would like to support this channel, a great way to do that is just by listening. You can also hit the like button, subscribe, and share with your friends and family on social media if they are curious about true crime cases the way that you are. And you can always go over to BuyMeACoffee.com. There's a link to that in the description box. BuyMeACoffee.com/BlackBoxNid88. And anybody who uses that website to make a donation or contribution to support the show will get a shout out here on Zodiac Mondays. Okay, so a couple weeks ago I was corresponding with somebody who uses the YouTube name Sphere the Cube, and last year on the channel, Sphere and I did a series together where I did the narrations for his material talking about his Zodiac Killer suspect Robert Volvins, as well as several observations that he made about the Zodiac Killers, ciphers, and of course also the Mount Diablo code, and trying to identify the location of a bomb that the Zodiac may have possibly buried. And Spheri asked me a particular question, not about his Zodiac suspect, Robert Volvins, but about a different Zodiac Killer suspect, Gary Francis Post, the suspect that has been put forward by the Casebreakers, and particularly by Dale Julin, who is the author of the upcoming book Catching Zodiac. And what Spheri asked me was, what is the Casebreakers' biggest piece of evidence in favor of Gary Francis Post being the Zodiac Killer? And I didn't even have to think too hard about this. I said, similarities to the composite sketch. Facial similarities to the sketches that were drawn after the murder of Paul Stine, the Zodiac Killer's final victim. And Siri and I were discussing different ways to analyze these, and there are apps that you can use, that you can download from the Play Store and so on, where you take photos of different people, and you rate how similar they are based on the structure of their faces. And then Spheri decided to do that with Gary Francis Post, as well as with the Zodiac Killer composite sketch, and then just because he decided to include my own Facebook profile picture. And in terms of similarities to the Zodiac Killer composite sketch, not based on the most professional techniques, but by analyzing these results via one of the analytical apps, Gary Francis' post had a 60% match, 60.6 to be precise, 60% match with the Zodiac Killer composite sketch. But my own picture, my profile picture from Facebook, had a 63% match, almost 64, 63.7%. So the Casebreakers have also talked about how it's not only that he has facial similarities to the composite sketch, it's also that he had certain scars on his forehead that match up with lines that were drawn on the Zodiac Killer composite sketch. On one of them. The lines are only there on one sketch, and their sketch was amended after the murder of Paul Stein. But that actually works against their case because the Zodiac was not described to have had scars on his forehead the way that Gary Francis posted. If anything, those were lines that were added by the artist as filler or details, or trying to show the age of the suspect. But it's amazing what technology can do, even if it is just something very basic that you could do on your phone. However, I would like to switch gears a little bit because some people had been sharing something on Facebook, and there was a lot of talk about a Zodiac Killer documentary that came out about 3 weeks ago, maybe about a month ago. And because this is the Zodiac Killer news report, I would like to keep up with current things that are happening following news and new developments, as well as new pieces of media that come out about the Zodiac Killer. And I had the chance to watch the documentary The Man with the Target on His Chest, and it is available on the channel Bandito, Bandito, Bandito. And if you do watch this one, I think that it's very well done, it's very well presented. There are lots of graphics, lots of visual imagery, and as well as they're using segments from the reports that are put on the screen. So overall, I think that it's very well made and presented. But if you have not watched this documentary yet, The Man with the Target on His Chest, you can keep listening to this episode. I always want my content to be available to people who have watched the show or not, or to people who have read the books or not that I'm discussing. And the documentary, The Man with the Target on His Chest, I mean, I had an immediate response. And that they are, of course, talking about the Zodiac Killer at Lake Berryessa when he went out in a hooded costume that was black, although he may have been wearing a dark blue windbreaker underneath the Lake Berryessa hood. It had somewhat of a rectangular top, clip-on sunglasses, and a piece of fabric that went down that had the Zodiac Killer symbol, the circle with the cross going through with it. Now, this might sound like it's petty. This might sound like it's just nitpicking. And nitpicking, yes. Petty, no. How on earth do we actually know that's a target? How do we actually know that that's a target on his chest? My immediate first instinct was when I first heard about the Zodiac Killer 25 years ago was that looked like the scope of a gun. That's what I thought about just looking at the symbol for the first time, and a lot of people talked about that because, as even stated in this same documentary, the Zodiac referenced the most dangerous game, talking about I like killing people because it's so much fun. It's even more fun than hunting wild game in the forest because man is the most dangerous animal of all. Similar to the short story, The Most Dangerous Game, but also using the word hunting. You think of a rifle and the scope of a gun. I think people come to that conclusion rather naturally, but it is not universally accepted why the Zodiac Killer chose that symbol. For example, the theorist Randy Kenny, who has proposed Louis Myers as a Zodiac suspect, has stated that it's not a scope of a gun or even anything astrological, it was a Celtic cross. And then there's another theory out there that was discussed on Geraldo Rivera's television show, and you can actually watch that on Tom Voigt's YouTube channel, Zodiac Killer Official, even to this day, where it states that, yes, it's a cross, but it maybe not a Celtic cross, maybe coming from Aleister Crowley. And, of course, one point that's even discussed in the documentary as well, The Man with the Target on His Chest, is that the symbol could have been attributed to the Zodiac Killer watch, and that, yes, this is a target, but it's also the zodiac symbol, meaning like you look at the at some depictions of the 12 astrological signs, and sometimes there's a circle that can be divided into four quadrants, and different astrological signs go in each quadrant. And I'll share some things about that later on. But one person who is a very large proponent of the Zodiac Killer symbol coming from the Zodiac brand of wristwatches is Drew Beeson, author of Sighting In on the Zodiac Killer, as well as the host of the Zodcast here on YouTube, who has just stated very clearly the symbol came from the Zodiac watches. The stuff about a Celtic cross or the cross used by Aleister Crowley, no, because those do not have the circle with the cross going through it partnered with the word Zodiac on it. And Drew Beeson has talked about his Zodiac killer suspect, Donald Lee Cheney, and number one, Cheney was friends with Arthur Lee Allen, the prime suspect. Arthur Lee Allen wore a Zodiac wristwatch. Number two, Don Cheney's father was a watchmaker, and his name was Ned Cheney. So I mean, I can put two and two together and see where he is going with that. And I don't even need to talk anymore about this because these are just my immediate first impressions looking at the title of a documentary that is made available here on YouTube. And you know, they say don't judge a book by its cover, so don't judge a documentary purely by the title. Actually, a better way of putting it would be don't judge a documentary purely by the thumbnail, but the title can speak for itself. Now, this episode or documentary began with the murder of Sherry Jo Bates in 1966, and the presenter on the Bandito channel stated very clearly that he believed that Sherry Jo Bates was a genuine Zodiac killer victim. I've talked about this a lot about how I do not think she was actually murdered by the Zodiac killer. Maybe the Zodiac alluded to her murder, but I just don't believe that it was the same killer. Sherry Jo Bates was murdered on October 30th of 1966 outside of the Riverside City College library. And, I mean, she was stabbed multiple times. She was slashed across her throat and neck. And there's been an enormous debate about how many times she was actually stabbed. It used to be stated as a universal fact that she was stabbed 42 times, but perhaps a closer estimation would be between 20 and 30. But still stabbed many times, put up a fight, very strong fight, and he also tore off a wristwatch that could have possibly and almost most likely belonged to the killer. Now, the point that was brought up in this documentary, The Man with the Target on His Chest, is something that I think is actually a pretty good one if they got all their facts right, and that is that there was a suspicious figure who was lurking in the vicinity of Sherry Jo Bates's murder prior to the crime actually taking place, who was estimated to have been 5 feet 11 inches tall, and I'm not sure the exact report that they were citing for that, but they did share that in the documentary. And I think 5 feet 11 inches tall will be rather consistent with some other witness descriptions that we'll see from the Zodiac crimes of the later 1960s. Okay, so that's the murder of Sherry Jo Bates, a crime that was possibly committed by the Zodiac killer. It is very widely accepted that the crime that took place in 1968, the murders of David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, were definitely committed by the Zodiac. They're referred to as the first confirmed victims of the Zodiac killer. David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen were murdered in a parking lot off of Lake Herman Road on December 20th of 1968 in the late PM hours. And prior to the murder, there's an incident. A young man named William Crow witnessed a suspicious vehicle that at first he states was driven by two different people, or that there's one person in the driver's seat and one person in the passenger seat. And later on in life, William Crow would go on to change his testimony, saying that he couldn't see the passenger seat. Instead, he just saw a Caucasian male in the front seat, and he was wearing glasses. And Tom Voigt even did an episode about this on his YouTube channel, or he included it in a particular episode, saying that William Crow just made himself somewhat unreliable, or His testimony changed. I added the word unreliable, but he had a complete reversal, and for some reason, maybe even some unknown reason, let's say, William Crowe decided to start saying that the person that he had witnessed driving the car looked like the Zodiac Killer composite sketch. Well, maybe he wasn't saying that back in 1968, and I think that that needed to be clarified, that there should be some reliability issues with William Crowe's testimony. But David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen were in a car at Lake Herman Road, and most people believe that they were ordered out of the car by the killer, and they were told to face the road, and that some type of words may have been exchanged, or the killer might have been saying something, but David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen were both murdered, shot to death with .22 caliber ammunition. Then the next crime that took place was the Blue Rock Springs shooting on July 4th of 1969, where Darlene Ferrin and Mike Michaud were both shot in a parked car at Blue Rock Springs. And there was a rather interesting discussion in the Man with the Target on His Chest, and that was that there are all of these witness descriptions about light-colored cars, or you're like color descriptions like white or silver or blue, but the car that Mike Mageau said that pulled in behind them at Blue Rock Springs, well, he described it as being possibly brown. So is that not inconsistent with any of these other witness statements? I don't know. I mean, it's also very dark at night. I mean, they were shot somewhere around 11:55 p.m. on July 4th of 1969. So in the nighttime, and they're in a park trying to be somewhat secluded, even with street lamps. I doubt they would get the exact color right. And they were, I mean, not to mention some people are extremely bad with colors, and there are people who are genuinely color blind. I'm not saying that Mike Mageau was. I'm just saying it's hard to tell the color of a car at night. But at the same time, I mean, light white colored versus brown. That is something. And what actually happens is Darlene Ferrin and Mike Mageau are seated in their car, and a suspicious vehicle pulls in behind them, and then that car leaves, and a car comes back. Now, was it the same car? We aren't really sure, but I've noticed that a lot of different documentaries, I repeat, different ones, have more or less universally accepted that that was the same car, that that was the Zodiac that pulled in, and they're trying to present the image of this guy who is hesitating or being nervous, and then he decides to drive off, and then he drives back. But, I mean, I'm not completely convinced that it was the same driver. However, it's possible, it's possible. And when I said a lot of documentaries have talked about that, I mean any form of media, podcasts, YouTube videos, all of that included. The next crime that took place was the Lake Berryessa stabbing on September 27th of 1969, which saw the Zodiac Killer wearing the previously mentioned hooded costume that may have had a target on his chest, or it may have been the symbol of Zodiac watches, or it may have been an astrological symbol, or it might have just been something that was simple that the killer wanted to kind of steal and commandeer, nautical term, right? Use for his own, because he wanted a basic symbol that firstly he could draw very easily at the end of his letters, but also something that he could use to give himself his own brand or identity. And by brand I meant genuinely like that, like a cattle brand, not like as opposed to something marketable, but actually a branded symbol. So I think that there could be elements of all of those things going on. But the Zodiac Killer's wearing this costume, and he walks down toward Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard, who are on a picnic blanket, and very, very clearly stated in the film, which I think was rather well done, is that Cecilia Shepard is the one who sees the Zodiac Killer walking and approaching them, and he goes behind the tree line, and she even sees him slip on the hooded mask, so she was able to say that he was a Caucasian male with no, not able to make out any particular facial features, but brown hair. And the thing that I thought that was the most interesting was that they talked about how in this documentary film, The Man with the Target on His Chest, Brian Hartnell estimated that the attacker was between the age of 20 and the age of 30. But you might already be thinking, Brian Hartnell did not see the killer's face. I mean, how would he know that the estimation was coming from 20 to 30? And it was left out that that was a voice estimation. And I mean, that's from everything that I've encountered, that Brian Hartnell was estimating that the voice that he heard came from a man who was 20 to 30 years old. And the presenter on the Bandito channel also talked about how he believed, referring to the presenter himself, believed that the killer was somewhere between 20, no, not 20, 200 to 250 pounds. I even think that that's a little bit too heavy to be the Zodiac killer. The foot impressions at Lake Berryessa that were done, well, like the casts were made by Hal Snook, and the estimations that were done from the foot impressions said that it was someone who was approximately 200 to 225 pounds. This partnered with the witness description from Mike Michaud after the Blue Rock Springs shooting, estimating that the killer was around 195 to 200 pounds. I think that we're dealing with someone a little bit lighter than 200 pounds. But when you hear the stuff about the attacker, or the suspicious figure in the vicinity of the Bates murder at 5'11", and then you hear this story of the attacker at Lake Berryessa who's around 200 pounds, and also Cecilia Shepard estimated that the Zodiac would have been 6 feet tall, the victim who passed away at after the Lake Berryessa stabbing. That all seems like it is tying together, and even though I don't think the Zodiac killer murdered Sherry Jo Bates, I do see how that narrative fits, that you would have this 5'11" perpetrator who I think would actually be a very good estimation for the actual Zodiac, because the Zodiac killer would have been wearing the hooded costume, which should have added at least 1 inch to his height. I'm guessing thereabouts, and also, there people have talked about other things that could have altered the Zodiac killer's height, such as standing on uneven ground. Maybe he was wearing two soles on his boots or shoes, like gluing the pair of boots to the wing walker so shoe sole tread, and it was trying to just disguise everything, and that's going to be adding inches to his height. And it's possible. I mean, all of these things are possible, because what we have to admit is that it's an unsolved case. But the only point that I'm trying to get at is, I believe that the Zodiac killer was around 5'10" and 5'10" and a half, 5 feet 11 inches tall, and 200 to 225 pounds. I'm 5 feet 8 inches tall, and I'm 200 pounds, and very few people describe me as bulky. So I can comprehend about how this person is not going to look extremely fat, and some people are just have it in their minds that 200 pounds, or even being 225, is going to be a very large person. But in reality, I do not necessarily think so. Another point, though, that I thought was left out of the witness descriptions from Lake Berryessa in this film, The Man with the Target on His Chest, was that Brian Hartnell was trying to estimate the Zodiac killer's height at Lake Berryessa, but they did not say that Brian Hartnell wasn't good at estimating heights or judging heights because of his own height, and Brian Hartnell was around 6'5", 6'6", 6'7", thereabout, definitely a taller person, so he had trouble estimating people's heights who were shorter than him. So the witness descriptions are varying very easily. And one point, though, that I am in 100% agreement with is that they said in this film on the Bandito channel that the Zodiac killer's height estimations are between 5 feet 8 inches tall and 6 feet tall. And I have said so many times on Black Box Online Radio that I believe the Zodiac killer genuinely was in that height range, 5 feet 8 inches tall to 6 feet tall. And I mostly don't seriously entertain suspects who were outside of the range of 5'8" to 6 foot. And of course, there might be a little bit of a millimeter here or there. I don't really think that it's like an absolute deal breaker, but it's definitely something that I don't entertain very seriously. And switching gears once again, speaking of suspects and theorists that I do not take very seriously, over the weekend I did the episode about Ed Edwards as a suspect in the murder of JonBenet Ramsey, and there is a true crime theorist out there named John Cameron who has created this very elaborate and intricate true crime theory about how Edward Wayne Edwards, a real serial killer, was responsible for hundreds of murders, including not only the Zodiac crimes, but also the murder of JonBenet Ramsey, the Black Dahlia, as well as Darlie Roudier's children, Lacey Peterson, Teresa Halbach, the woman who's the subject of the documentary Making a Murderer. I mean, very high-profile crimes, too. And going back in time to the Black Dahlia Avenger case, I just want to be very clear about something. Ed Edwards would have been 13 years old at the time, and I mean that he murdered Elizabeth Short. Did he also commit the mutilations, as Steve Hodel reminds us, bisecting the second and third lumbar vertebrae of this woman? And even if there's going to be some type of twisted story that no, he didn't actually do that, I mean, 13 years old and living thousands of miles away in Ohio, I just don't think Ed Edwards was the Black Dahlia Avenger. But furthermore, as a Zodiac killer suspect, I will restate some things that I have shared in that episode on the murder of JonBenet Ramsey, because there are points why Ed Edwards could be the Zodiac killer. Number one, he was a real serial killer. Number two, he targeted couples in cars parked in Lover's Lane type settings. The Zodiac killer targeted couples parked in cars or nearby cars in Lover's Lane type settings. And not to mention that Ed Edwards spent time in prison in Montana, and the Zodiac killer said that he had escaped from a prison in Montana. And it's possible, I repeat possible, and I'm going off of just little sayings that people have shared on the internet because that's, well, what people do these days, that there's this underground belief system that was going through the Montana prisons where they're talking about slaves in the afterlife, and the Zodiac killer said very clearly that he will die and be reborn in paradise, and those whom he has killed will be his slaves. So even if that last one isn't completely true, or that Ed Edwards was never exposed to that stuff, the other points, though, I can comprehend them. But when you put it in the entire context about how all of these crimes, 660 murders attributed to Ed Edwards, are, well, is that what really happened? And I think the answer is almost certainly not. Now, there's another true crime theorist out there that does something a little bit similar, but much, much, much milder and a less outrageous way, and that is the previously mentioned Steve Hodel, who has talked a lot about the Black Dahlia Avenger case. Steve Hodel is a supporter of the theory that the Zodiac Killer and the Black Dahlia Avenger were one and the same, and that it was his own father, George Hill Hodel. George Hodel also gets accused of at least 25 of other murders by Steve Hodel. I mean, 25 in context compared to 660 seems like a small number. I suppose everything is relative. Back in 2020, I did an episode called Zodiac Killer Steve Hodel Theory Investigate, and I was trying not to use the word debunked, because I was actually inspired by the magician James Randi, who used to host a show called Paranormal Investigator, where he talked about how he didn't want to debunk people because it's not about proving somebody wrong. It's about investigating and finding out what's really going on. But of course, I gave in a little bit too much, and in 2021, I launched the Zodiac Killer Debunking series here on this channel, where I would talk about Zodiac Killer suspects whom I thought absolutely were not the Zodiac Killer. And to be very clear, I was not trying to ruin anybody else's research or trying to destroy anybody's reputation. It was simply about stating the reasons why I genuinely thought that this person was not the Zodiac, and the reasons why I thought this person should be on the lower end of the totem pole. So, I think that investigation, debunking, those are all just labels, and that's more or less where I stand now. But the reason why I chose to do that episode on Steve Hodel's theory, which was an old black box recording, was that I noticed that it didn't even seem like he genuinely thought his father, George Hodel, was the Zodiac Killer, and there were just pieces of language that he would use in the presentation, saying, my father, George Hodel, the Black Dahlia Avenger, did this. Now let's compare him to the Zodiac Killer. I'm like, well, wait a second. If you believe that your father was both the Zodiac Killer and the Black Dahlia Avenger, then why is he saying it like that? Why is he presenting it like that? Shouldn't he say, my father was both the Zodiac Killer and the Black Dahlia Avenger, and here's why? And I know I was just cherry picking a few choice words or a few specific pieces of language, but at the same time, that's what's actually happening. That's the way he presented it. And I began to have a lot of room for doubt in that Steve Hodel even believed the Zodiac theory at all, which is discussed in his book Most Evil Part 2. And there are several other books out. He has a series on Black Dahlia Avenger 1, 2, and 3, and Most Evil Part 1, Most Evil Part 2. And I believe he had a new plan for a book called The Early Years, where he was talking about George Hodel's crimes before the Black Dahlia case. But here's a point. Here's a point that should not be neglected. And that is that if Steve Hodel were genuinely selling a book where he's talking about his father as a Zodiac killer suspect, but he didn't actually believe that his father was the Zodiac killer, that's fraud. Like, that's fraudulent behavior. And I don't know what's in his mind or in his heart or what he's actually thinking, but the way it's presented, I definitely get suspicious. And I think the reasons why so many people give Steve Hodel a pass are very simple. Number one, he deserves a certain amount of respect for his theory in the Black Dahlia case that his father, George Hodel, was the Black Dahlia Avenger, that he murdered Elizabeth Short. He makes a very clear, cogent, and consistent narrative that I can comprehend, and it is something that I can follow in a sequential manner, and it's not like I can tell you 15 Black Dahlia suspects off the top of my head. I can tell you a handful of them, but less than that. And I'm definitely not an expert on the case, but George Hodel seems like a rather strong suspect, and I could do a solid hour on all the reasons why I think George Hodel was the person who murdered Elizabeth Short back in the 1940s. And a lot of this, I mean, the loudest voice in the world that George Hodel was the Black Dahlia Avenger was from Steve Hodel. So I think that people have a certain amount of respect for that. And the second point that I think a lot of people are thinking about but are choosing not to say is that they want to hear what he has to say next. Once he starts saying that his father was the Zodiac Killer, the Black Dahlia Avenger, as well as committing murders in the Philippines, such as the 1967 murder of Lucilla Lalou, then they just want to know, well, firstly, what was that story? Okay. Now, what story happened next? What was the reason why these stories keep going? And I think there's a particular type of curiosity that people have. And with John Cameron, absolutely the same story. They just want to know, what is he going to do next with his wild true crime theory? But that's just my take on the subject. And if anybody would like to challenge me on that, please put your idea in the comment section down below. The only thing I request is state a reason why you think that and how you came to that particular conclusion. Now, I've told you guys in the past that I was reading the book The Unabomber and the Zodiac by Douglas Oswell, and as I go through that book, I'm finding all of these discussions about sex, that's right, S-E-X, and about how is it possible that the Zodiac Killer was some type of sexually deprived maniac. And the reason why Douglas Oswell is saying that is because his suspect was Theodore Kaczynski, the Unabomber, stating that the Unabomber and the Zodiac were one and the same. It's amazing how all of these theorists connect their crimes to the Zodiac Killer. So yes, the Zodiac murdered JonBenet Ramsey, the Zodiac murdered Elizabeth Short, the Black Dahlia, the Zodiac was also the Unabomber, and that's why I made a video back in 2021 called The World of the Zodiac Killer, just trying to document as many examples as I could. And I've talked to the filmmaker who made that one. I was like, we really need to do a second episode or just a second list of these things, because there's so many more examples that have come up that I've just found because I'm doing this Zodiac Monday segment with you guys. But in these discussions, I was reminded of not Ted Kaczynski, but a different criminal, and that was James Holmes, the Aurora, Colorado shooter. As I was reading the book, The Unabomber and the Zodiac, I was just thinking about how so many observations I had made about James Holmes were relevant to this discussion. And with him, I think that a lot of it tied to sexuality, rejection, and the lack of intimacy. And right now, I would like to do a discussion similar to the Versus series that I did last year, comparing the Zodiac Killer to James Holmes, the Aurora shooter. And the Versus series is something that I have assembled into a playlist here on BlackBoxOnlineRadio. And I have been talking about two different criminals and comparing and contrasting the psychological elements in their activities. But to provide a basic introduction about James Holmes and the Aurora, Colorado shooting, I would like to go to an article that's actually posted on History.com that says 2012, on July 20th of that year, Aurora shooting leaves 12 dead and 70 wounded. On July 20th of 2012, a mass shooting occurred at a theater in Aurora, a Denver suburb, killing 12 people, the youngest a 6-year-old girl, and injuring at least 70 others. The Aurora shooting took place at shortly after the start of a crowded midnight showing of The Dark Knight Rises, which opened across the United States that day. It was the deadliest mass shooting in Colorado since 1999, and that, of course, was the Columbine shooting, in which 12 students were murdered and a teacher was murdered as well. The massacre in Aurora began when 24-year-old James Holmes entered a theater at the Century 16 multiplex through a parking lot exit door and threw gas canisters into the theater. He was dressed in a gas mask and black combat gear, leading some people in the audience to think that he was performing a stunt for the film, a Batman sequel that was eagerly anticipated by fans. And this point about him wearing the gas mask, at first, it was just widely discussed that James Holmes was dressed up as the Joker because the Joker is featured in the movie The Dark Knight, played by Heath Ledger, and that this guy dressed himself up as the Joker and he committed the mass shooting in clown makeup and had colored hair. But other reports and other descriptions of the incident were just that he had dyed his hair the bright color and he was wearing this gas mask, as you heard. So definitely not something that has been um, truly important to the discussion. And Batman sequel eagerly anticipated by fans. Instead, Holmes opened fire at the audience, shooting people at random. Police quickly arrived on the scene, and Holmes was apprehended behind the movie theater. He put up no resistance. Not long after, law enforcement agents evacuated buildings near Holmes's Aurora apartment after he told them that he had booby-trapped his home with explosive devices. When Holmes made his first appearance in court on July 23rd, his hair was dyed neon orange, and he seemed dazed and devoid of emotion. Investigators learned that in the months leading up to the Aurora movie theater shooting, Holmes had acquired weapons from Colorado gun shops and ordered thousands of rounds of ammunition online. A native of San Diego, California, he had enrolled in a PhD neuroscience program at the University of Colorado in Aurora in 2011, but he had dropped out in June 2012 after failing an important exam. Court documents later revealed that a month before the Aurora, Colorado shooting, a University of Colorado psychiatrist had treated Holmes, reported to the campus police that he could be a danger to the public and that he had threatened her. Holmes, who has offered no motive for the shooting spree, eventually was charged with 166 counts of murder, attempted murder, and weapons charges. In May of 2013, he pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. In 2015, after a trial, Holmes was sentenced to 12 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. And I remember something about the news headline that went out. I think it was one of those things on the bottom line as the news went by that said he was sentenced to over 3,000 years in prison, these 12 life sentences consecutively. And I mean, that's definitely where he belongs. And also with somebody like James Holmes, you can see very clearly that it's all calculated. He has the awareness to put on silly faces when he wants to, but he provided no motive for the shooting. I mean, if he has the awareness to pose for photographs in a certain way, I wouldn't say that he's not guilty by mental disease or defect. I think that this person was a jerk who wanted attention. The Zodiac killer was a jerk who wanted attention. And James Holmes was most likely a sexually deprived person who lacked intimacy in his life. He had abandoned dating site profiles, an adult friend finder. It's possible that he used prostitutes. And it's just these stories of someone who wanted to be accepted in a sexual and intimate way, but wasn't. And these things about the Unabomber Ted Kaczynski are perhaps even worse and even more intense, but I don't know if James Holmes experienced some things, like just talking about absolutely everybody just thinks Ted Kaczynski is weird and no one wants to love him. It's probably very similar, and with the Zodiac killer, a lot of people are in the same boat, that this was some guy who felt like he had been denied heterosexual intimacy, and that's why the first three Zodiac crimes were targeting lovers' lanes, or they're targeting men and women who are together in cars. At Lake Herman Road, at Blue Rock Springs, and at Lake Berryessa, there is a man and a woman who are present, a male and a female victim. And the youngest victims, of course, were David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen. David Faraday was 17 years old at the time, and Betty Lou Jensen was 16. But it goes to show that so you have a person who is very well educated, actually, as you heard, James Holmes, PhD student, and the Zodiac killer is thought to have been rather well educated, and that his misspellings were all intentional. And then you also have somebody who, again, has awareness of his faculties, the way that I've just stated that I think James Holmes did, and otherwise he wouldn't know to put on the silly faces at only certain moments because he doesn't look the same way all the time. And I think the Zodiac killer also had awareness of his mental faculties. And it's important because people have proposed suspects who were schizophrenics and heavy drug users, and that's all just questionable. But the point that I wanted to share in contrast is something that I talked about in the 3 episodes that I did on James Holmes here for this channel. And that is that James Holmes contemplated becoming a serial killer. And he chose not to do that because he thought that a mass shooting would give him a higher body count, and perhaps he was right. I mean, you see somebody like the Zodiac killer committing a crime spree over 10 months, and only 5 victims were murdered. And somebody like James Holmes had some more intense bloodlust than that, which is horrible, which is a very bad thing, but that is what happened. He thought that being a mass shooter would give him a higher body count, but that is also very revealing about the Zodiac, and that is that the Zodiac isn't so focused on committing the murders or the crimes. He's focused on the attention that he gets from them, and also that the Zodiac has not truly abandoned normal life and society. Instead, the Zodiac killer is someone who wanted to commit his crimes in the shadows and the darkness, or Lake Berryessa during the daytime wearing all black like he's turning himself into the darkness. So I think that that is just so important because this isn't someone who is so driven by impulse and urge and rejection and sadness and despair that he is doing this. No, that might be a little bit of a factor, but what could be a bigger factor with the Zodiac killer's decision making? Calculation, cold, methodical, and calculating behavior, trying to prove that he is superior, trying to create a crime and leave clues behind, and still, nobody will ever figure it out, and nobody has. Nobody has identified the Zodiac killer. So, I think that that is a very strong difference. Yeah, the whole thing about hating people who are able to live normal lives, yeah, I think that exists between James Holmes, the Aurora shooter, and the Zodiac. But the way they chose to respond, one of them wanted destruction, the other just wanted people to have some very sick and disgusted attention-seeking behavior put in his direction. That's just what the Zodiac wanted. That's why people say the Zodiac was a domestic terrorist, not only a serial killer. And yes, the Zodiac people just wanted people to be afraid. The Zodiac just wanted to create the persona, where somebody like James Holmes, a mass shooter, just wanted to kill people. I mean, as I said, he thought that being a serial killer wouldn't generate a a high body count. He wanted to kill people. The Zodiac just wanted us to talk about him over and over again, and in some sick, twisted way, he has succeeded. Well, that's all for me now on this episode, and the final thing that I would like to do is to go to the supporter shoutouts, and this week we have one from Batman66. I appreciate your reliable support, Batman, and, Batman66 concluding this segment after the Batman Killer, as the Aurora Shooter has also been called. Some surprises. But that will be all for me now, and anybody can write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio at AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is in the description box, and there is always BlackBoxNed88 over on Instagram. And I will see you there for the bonus podcast. Goodbye.